Today, we're jumping into the incredible story of how a tiny Himalayan kingdom and a massive global empire went from being bitter enemies to close allies. It's this wild tale of power, diplomacy, and sheer survival, all shaped by a few really important treaties. So let's just think about this for a second. How does a small country, tucked away in the highest mountains in the world, even begin to handle a relationship with a superpower that's literally setting up shop on its border? This is way more than just a history lesson. It's a masterclass in strategy. All right, so let's set the scene. It's the 1700s. You've got the British East India Company, this absolute behemoth, a commercial and military giant, spreading across India. And pretty soon, its territory is pushing right up against Bhutan's southern border. You just know something's got to give when these two worlds collide. And yeah, that collision, it happened fast. This wasn't some friendly hello neighbor situation. Nope. The relationship started out with straight-up hostility and a lot of fighting, mostly happening down on the flat plains right at the base of the mountains. Okay, so how did this all kick off? Well, the Bhutanese were constantly raiding these areas called the doors. You can think of them as the gateways from the mountains down to the plains. But the thing that really lit the fuse was in 1772. Bhutan invaded a territory called Cooch Behar, which the East India Company had sworn to protect. That one move, it was the trigger for the very first war between them. After that initial round of fighting, I think both sides kind of realized, hey, this constant war thing, it's expensive and exhausting. And that's when you start to see those first, very tentative steps away from the fighting and toward, actually talking to each other. And what came out of those talks? The very first major agreement, the Anglo-Bhutanese Treaty of 1774. For the British, led by a guy named Warren Hastings, the plan was pretty straightforward. 1, stop the fighting, and 2, and this is a big one, open up a trade route through Bhutan to get to the markets in Tibet. It was a classic case of wanting peace and profit. But, surprise, surprise, that peace, it was super short-lived. You know how it goes. You fix one problem and another one just pops up. In this case, a new, really vaguely defined border became the source of constant arguments and trouble. So check out this timeline because it really shows how things started to unravel again. In 1826, the British took over Assam, and boom, just like that, they're now next-door neighbors with Bhutan along this massive, long new border. And, being that close just led to more raids, more tension. You can see where this is going, right? Back to war. So yeah, all that tension that had been building up, it finally just exploded. Diplomacy had completely failed, and all the fighting in the Dwars escalated into a full-on war, one that was going to change the relationship between these two forever. And it all happened so fast. There was a quick little war in 1863 that basically proved things couldn't go on as they were. So the very next year, in 1864, the British went all in and launched the Dewar War. A year later, it was over, Bhutan had been defeated, and now the British were in a position to call all the shots.
And this, right here, this is really the heart of our story. Because what happened after the war led to a series of treaties that didn't just end the fighting, they completely redefined Bhutan's place in the world, taking it from a defeated enemy to a strategic partner.
This timeline gives us a fantastic bird's eye view. We already covered that first one from 1774. So now we're going to zoom in on the two big ones from the British era, Sinchula and Punakha, and see how they set the stage for the modern relationship with India.
This table lays it all out perfectly. First, you've got the Treaty of Sinchula in 1865. Bhutan loses all the Dewars, we're talking its most valuable lowlands, and in return, it gets an annual cash payment. This is basically a surrender document. But then, fast forward in 1910, the Treaty of Punakha. The whole dynamic shifts. Now, Bhutan gives up control of its foreign policy, but the annual payment doubles, and Britain promises to stay out of Bhutan's business at home. See the change? Bhutan is becoming a formal British protectorate.
So if you want to understand that 1865 treaty, it really all comes down to this number, 50,000 rupees. And let's be clear, this wasn't just payment for the land they lost. It was a leash, an annual payment that made Bhutan financially dependent on the British, giving them a ton of influence. And by 1910, that influence had grown, and so did the price tag. The subsidy doubled to 100,000 rupees. And no, this wasn't just a cost of living increase. It was a strategic investment. It was Britain's way of making sure Bhutan stayed a friendly buffer state on its northern border. And if you need proof that the relationship was warming up, here it is. Get this. In 1904, just a few decades after they were at war, the King of Bhutan himself is seen traveling with a British colonel on a high-stakes mission to Tibet. I mean, from sworn enemies to partners on a critical mission, that's a huge deal, and it paved the way directly for that 1910 treaty we just talked about.
All right, so what happens to this very unique relationship when the whole game changes? I mean, what happens when the British pack up and leave India in 1947? Well, with Indian independence, all those old treaties with the British were basically null and void. But the relationship was just too valuable to let go of. So in 1949, the newly independent India and Bhutan signed a brand new treaty, one that was designed to keep that same spirit of friendship and close cooperation going.
And how did India show it was serious? By opening up the checkbook. The annual payment jumped all the way to 500,000 rupees. That was a massive statement. It was India saying, hey, this partnership is a big deal to us, and we're willing to invest in it even more heavily than the British did. So, what's the big takeaway here? We saw a relationship completely transform, from all-out war to a strategic alliance. We saw how these formal treaties were used to lock in those changes in power. We also saw how cash, these subsidies, became this super important tool for influence. And maybe the most important part? The foundation that was built over a century ago is still a critical piece of the puzzle in South Asian politics today.
Which leaves us with one final thing to chew on. When you have a massive power imbalance, a real giant and a minnow situation, what does friendship between nations actually mean? Is it a true partnership of equals, or is it more of a practical arrangement for survival? The story of Bhutan and the British gives us a really fascinating and, yeah, a pretty complicated answer.